So it's my pleasure to introduce these two talented gals. Linda Ries has a bachelor's degree in forest biology from Colorado State University. She is a certified arborist with the International Society of Arboriculture since 1996, and she has served on the tree committee, the Hailey Tree Committee, since 2015. She is the former community forester for the Sawtooth National Forest and was the conservation education coordinator for the Forest Service's Intermountain region. In 1996, she established the BCRD Native Plant Arboretum, which is located near the intersection of the bike path and Fox Creek Acres Road in Hailey. I highly recommend you check it out. There are all kinds of wonderful trees and shrubs there that are suitable for drought-tolerant landscape. And if you're really interested in planting native plants, it's a remarkable resource. Stephanie Cook is both an International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist and municipal arborist. She received a bachelor's degree in horticulture and crop science from Ohio State University. Stephanie has worked for the City of Hailey for 5 years and is the Parks Division Manager, which in that capacity, she manages trees in the right-of-way and city-owned parks and oversees the mowing, pruning, irrigation, weed abatement, and general maintenance around Hailey. She is the city's liaison to the Tree Committee and the Blaine County Parks and Land Board. Established in 2008, the Tree Committee is a recommending body with a purpose to promote sound arboricultural practices and tree diversity, and to promote public education of proper tree care practices. So we'll give you a warm but quiet virtual welcome. Linda and Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the intro. So our talk, we want to talk about pruning small shade trees with skill and purpose. Linda, do you have anything to add before we get going?
Just that I'm just so happy everyone can join us tonight. And we really hope that, you know, besides tonight, that you guys can join us for actually a demo. Looking at trees, hands-on trees. Mm-hmm. And we thank Kristen for doing this. This is fantastic.
All right.
Yeah. So we're going to let Stephanie start.
Okay, Linda, you can go ahead to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Yep. Got it.
Dr. Shigo is a brilliant, just wealth of knowledge. And he has a lot of good information that he's put out over decades. But he said pruning is one of the best things we can do for a tree and also one of the worst things we can do for a tree. The example on the left of a topped tree, those are very poor cuts and poor places on the tree, most likely. And so much of the canopy has been removed, the tree can no longer successfully or efficiently produce the sugars and the food needed to sustain its existence. So the tree on the right is a healthy tree with a really nice structure. It's a thin structure, so there's plenty of opportunity for wind to pass through and sunshine to shine through. So pruning can be life or death for a tree. Okay, Linda. So what makes a tree a tree? Typically, a tree has one main woody stem, and when mature can be over 12 feet tall. As you can see in the picture, that is a good example of a tree, a mature tree. The one stem you can see at the bottom, which is about 5 feet, and then it branches to make the rest of its height. Shrubs are typically smaller, though they can also reach pretty large sizes, but they are multi-stemmed. Typically, they multi-stem from the bottom. So from the ground, instead of having one trunk and then multiple stems, they are multi-stemmed right from the ground. So understanding the difference between a tree and a shrub, along with the goals of what you are wanting the pruning to achieve, that will dictate how you prune. So understanding the difference between a tree and a shrub will ultimately guide your pruning decisions.
Stephanie asked folks if they recognize where this tree is.
Oh, that's great, Linda. Does anybody recognize the tree or the teeny tiny person in the picture?
I don't see any answers whizzing on the chat, but that's got to be Roberta McKercher Park, doesn't it?
Yes, it's along the
Yeah.
highway in the front of Roberta McKercher. So this photo is facing south. It's actually facing the airport.
And it's Carl Helm.
Yeah.
And we took this 2 years ago at Arbor Day because Carl Helm had been on our tree committee for many years, but I actually have a picture of when we planted this tree around 96, 97, and Carl was there. So it was kind of fun. But, all right, next slide.
Yes, thank you. So the first thing is to determine whether or not your tree truly needs to be pruned. What are your goals? Are you pruning for structure? Are you pruning for fruiting? Are you pruning out the dead? Are you lightening up the load of the branch for possible hazard or risk reasons? So the best thing you can do is take a step or two or three or four away from your tree and look at the whole tree, see the big picture and determine, see if you can identify broken branches or dead branches, or if thinning is an issue, say for fruit production, to give a better opportunity for fruit production. So the first step is to determine whether or not the tree truly needs to be pruned, given the goal of the tree, the reason for the tree, most likely in your yard. Thanks, Linda. So before you prune, so once you decided that your tree truly needs to be pruned, understanding simple biology, how do trees work? What makes them grow? Why do they have leaves? Why do they lose their leaves? Why do they respond and react the way that they do? Another thing to understand is how a tree responds to pruning, how the importance between a good pruning cut and a poor pruning cut, and what that could look like for the tree in the upcoming years of the tree's life down the road. And then, like it was mentioned earlier, you need to know why you're pruning. Is it thinning the crown? Is it getting rid of dead branches? And then once you are able to identify these pieces, then the next step is to make your pruning cuts. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to talk very simply about plant biology, and we're not going to get into any depth here, but again, it's kind of important to remember, like Stephanie says, how does that tree function? If you kind of understand how plants function, then you understand the impacts from, say, doing anything to the tree, especially pruning. So we all know what photosynthesis is. And again, it's just this complex process that the tree uses, in the leaves, using chlorophyll to produce sugars of varied types. And those sugars, of course, are building blocks for all the different compounds a plant can create. So just kind of keeping that in mind. And then I like to think of trees as a living factory. And it, you know, when I actually taught environmental ed for a long time, project learning tree, and it was a very simple way to communicate to kids, talking about a tree as a living factory. They're like, yeah, I get what a factory is. So, you know, in a factory, you put in raw materials, add some energy, which would be sunlight, and then you create something, which is glucose or sugars. And those sugars are so important for a tree because that's what fuels the whole tree, the whole growth process. Without those sugars, trees will not grow. And then talking about what happens to trees come fall and they're starting to get ready to go and become dormant during the winter, the leaves fall off. But in the meantime, excess sugars that have been created are flushed down into the roots to be stored. And then it's kind of like a bank. When spring comes, it gets warm, sap is running. What is sap? Sap has sugars in it. Those sugars are going back up to the tops of the trees, the branches, and it's the sugars that help the tree to start the whole process over. So of course, think about it, without those sugars, those extra sugars, it'd be that much harder for the tree to go on. So it's, keep in mind, it's that balance of the sugars in the tree that help it grow and keep it healthy. So yeah, pruning will change that. Why? Because we're removing branches that create, you know, grow leaves and grow sugar. So thinking about, you know, that, how that affects the tree. And so that's why, and I'm sure some of you have heard this, we've actually gone with the lower end. A lot of arborists will say, do not remove more than 1/3 of the tree's live branches. But we've also read that 1/4 is a better target. Because you know how it is, you go out, you go, I have my checklist of all the things I want to do to this tree. I'm like, I really want to take that branch too, and that one. And all of a sudden you look back and you go, oops, it's not that hard to remove a lot of branches, live branches. You know, if you're cutting dead, you know, broken, you know, those branches aren't functioning. So those aren't part of that 1/4 of the tree crown to worry about. It's the live branches. So always kind of consider that, because, you know, there's always next year. If you want to prune some of it this year, there's always next year. It's always better not to overdo it. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when you, besides the tree is starved, and then the sprouting issue. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen a tree like this. I've seen actually spruce that have like little branches, little tiny branches, because it's been pruned pretty hard. But these are called, there's multiple names. So these are sometimes called epicormic sprouts, sometimes suckers or water sprouts. Some trees just tend to get these pretty easily. But what these are these are branches that have clumps of branches that have come out from what are dormant buds that normally you wouldn't maybe even see a branch out of along the trunk. If you've ever been someplace where there's been a very harsh frost, a lot of the trees been killed because of frost. Sometimes those trees will just send out all of a sudden these very interesting cluster of sprouts. as a result of that, because part of the tree's been harmed. But also, this is an indication that someone was a little zealous in their pruning and kind of overdid it. And this is not a good thing. Most of the time, these sprouts are really weakly attached, and they're just not that good. And then you have a whole issue of going back and trying to remove some of these so they're not a hazard later. So, all right, Stephanie.
The 3 growing points on a tree that we are going to talk about. The buds on a branch are along the edges, the sides of the branch, and then you have the buds on the tip. The buds along the branch can be they will form into either smaller branches to encourage more of that woody growth, or eventually become leaves. And the same for the apex. Those can be more branches, buds, leaf buds. Then there are cambium cells under the bark that grow. And then the root tips, which are under the dirt, and that's a whole different pruning conversation. So understanding the 3 growth points on a tree, understanding the appropriate areas and places to prune will encourage the best growth. If pruning takes place and those growth points aren't really understood, then an improper cut will be made, and then the tree will most likely not be able to recover from a poor pruning cut, which will impact the life of the tree moving forward. Yeah, there's a lot of information regarding cell formation on that slide, which we could spend an hour on that one slide, I think. So this is the photo on the left is a snapshot of what buds truly look like on a tree. So once you see those buds beginning to break, and which has happened, the top arrow, the red arrow on the left there, if you prune that, you lose all of that growth. So the seasonal growth that comes in. So you want to be really, really careful of what you're pruning. Timing really is everything when you prune. So the older growth is going to be closer to the trunk, which would be the bottom portion of the photo. So where the leaf scar is, for this example, it's growth a couple years ago. And then you can see the inner node area, which is labeled up a little bit farther, in between the scars by the bud scales of prior years. So you want to be very, very careful that you can identify where the leaf scars are and where the growth takes place from year to year to year, where that stacks on top of each other. So those are growth points where in between seasons. And so those are good places to prune. You want to prune at those growth areas. And we'll cover that in the upcoming slides, but recognizing where those areas are and then making the appropriate cuts, that's how you exhibit the best pruning practices to accomplish your goals and encourage good growth and maintain a healthy tree.
And before we move to the next
Yeah,
ones,
please.
So what we're not going to spend a lot of time on, because that could be a whole hour on its own, is pruning fruit trees. So I'm glad that Kristen introduced that book there at the library. timing and everything is so much different than just pruning a shade tree. But one of the things you'll know, if you have apple trees or other types of fruit trees, that a lot of times along here on these side buds might be your, those flowering buds for your fruit tree, as well as at the ends. So just some disclaimer that we decided we have to kind of limit this one. So, all right, next
Thanks,
slide.
Linda. Yeah, so shade trees. So along with fruits that could possibly be pruned off, also flowers. So if you have a flowering tree, you would risk pruning your flower buds off too.
And Kristen, I think you talked about in the book you had, it talked about, I forget what was the term for the little side pieces, like they're kind of like short little stems where the apples are actually, what are those called? I mean, there's another name.
Yeah, they're called spurs.
Thank you.
Yeah, and they're an area that grows very, very slowly where you're showing the branch, the 1-year-old side branch that you were pointing out, that grows pretty fast, but spurs grow really short. And so oftentimes spurs will only grow a quarter or a half an inch a year. So they pack up on each other. So there's a different look to them in fruit trees.
And as Stephanie said, so from this top bud to right here, see that circular scar, that was last year's. Then you go down and you see this other one, so that was the year before. So you can kind of get a sense. One of the things that's nice about being able to look at a branch is you can actually get a sense of if that tree's growing well by how long those distances are. Okay, next one.
Yes. Thank you. So pruning trees creates a wound. So beware of where the branch collar and branch bark ridge are. Never cut into these areas. Flush cuts do not heal. So you're creating a wound that would welcome fungus or diseases or insects, depending on what the tree species is that you're pruning. You're inviting problems, really. So the photo on the left is a good example of a flush cut. The left and right sides of the photo, or of the cut, I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks, Linda. You can see where that's starting to callus and grow and heal. But the top and the bottom was cut into that ridge. And those areas won't heal well. So those areas that won't heal, that's where the invitation for pests of, depending on the species, that's where that will come in. The middle photo is from an improper cut. There was no cut to the underside of the branch. So if your branch, even small branches, but a little bit bigger branches tend to do this because of the weight of the branch. When you cut straight down the branch, the weight of the branch swings down and rips the bark on the trunk, which you can see that it's beginning to do there a little bit. That also is an improper cut, and that won't heal correctly because you're ripping the cells off of the bottom part of that cut. And so there's no way for it to grow and heal. On the right side, that flush cut, similar to the left, on the top, it is just not able to grow back. The cut, yep, exactly where the cursor is. It's cut it's too straight up and down. It should have been angled out a little bit farther. So the cells that were needed to regrow and create that callus and grow over that cut that you see in the photo are gone. So the tree is not able to create those cells. Therefore, the tree is not able to heal that wound. Where on the bottom, though it's labeled as a flush cut, you can see the callus all the way around that tree. That's what you're looking for. But the darker area inside of that circular callus area where Linda has the cursor, there's too much of a stub left. So the branch wasn't cut close enough to the trunk, so that stub that was sticking out will prevent that callus from growing around. So that also creates a wound, which will ultimately invite pests in, which will damage potentially the longevity of that tree. Thanks, Linda. So this is a good, really good snapshot. So we wanted to stick with shade trees because, again, it's just such a broad, we could talk for days. Conifers, which is what's pictured here, they have less of a noticeable, the ridge is less visible than on hardwoods. So they're a little harder to prune because of how that ridge encircles that branch and trunk union. The photo on the bottom on the right, that gives a really good explanation of how that tree grows and what that branch collar and ridge looks like. So where the A arrow is pointing, thank you, Linda, that cut is important. That's why the bark tore on the previous slide, because that cut wasn't initially made. And then the B cut cuts all the way through the branch. And then if your cut tears the bark, it'll stop where the A cut is made, and it won't go down the rest of the branch and across the collar and down the trunk. So once you have the weight of the branch removed and you're left with that small little area between where B and C are, thanks, Linda. Once you have that small amount of wood and the load, that weight load removed, then you can successfully make that cut from C to D and stay out of the collar and off of that ridge, and you don't have the weight to make that potential tear. And then that's where you have your appropriate cut that will heal successfully, because you have the cells you need to create that callus, and then you'll have a healthy heal, and you'll have a healthy tree that you never invited those pests to. Thanks, Linda. And then on this this aspen, hardwoods have a visible branch ridge. The collar is not as obvious. So depending on what your species is, sometimes they're a little bit easier to prune than others. And this one, the pruning wound has never closed over this aspen. The cut was made, and I don't even want to say cut. It looks like it was probably broken. Any kind of, it could have been wind or an animal, who knows, but it looks like a break, and it never healed just because it was not a proper cut. Thanks, Linda. So we covered.
Sorry. You couldn't see. Okay. Some of it's covered, but I think it's okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I see. We covered this a little bit. A dead branch shows callus tissue at the collar. So this again illustrates where the brown arrow, you remove the weight, but the D cut that leaves too much of a stub. So the collar won't be able to form around that. So you'll be left with that stub and ultimately an open wound. A C cut where the C, yeah, thank you. You're going to go into that collar. So you're going to prune out those cells that are needed to close and heal that wound. So the A to B cut is outside of that collar and outside of.
I'll be back.
Oh, no, that's great, Linda. If you want to go to the next slide, having that A, that A to B cut is outside of the collar and outside of that ridge, but you're cutting that stub off, and that's where your opportunity is for that to heal. So this is I think this is a really interesting photo, and it really shows how, what trees look like and how they function. Those, all of those sugars move throughout the tree, and you can kind of see some of those, pathways in there. So you have your branch collar, which is marked number 1. So that's the area you want to prune outside of. And you can kind of see the little letter C, where those 2 arrows are. That's where you want to make your cut. And then outside of that bark ridge, which is number 2, and then the branch protection zone, these are all interior pieces of that branch into that trunk. And then the dormant bud and pith protection zone and the pith, that just gives a good snapshot of what that branch looks like in its attachment to the trunk. And it just gives a snapshot of why it's important and what is truly inside that trunk and what is happening, as to why that cut is so important and why it won't heal correctly if made incorrectly. So that's just more of an in-depth photo and example of why it's important to make appropriate pruning cuts.
And this was a photo from Dr. Shigo. So his research focused a lot on the interior of the tree. So he did a lot of these cuts. So he cut the tree in half so he could analyze the different types of pruning cuts. And that's what he had found. It was so amazing. So the branch projection zone, actually the tree has, it uses chemicals, special cells within that repel, like Stephanie said, the decay. And without actually looking inside the tree, there wasn't really any way to know, but his research was all about what is happening inside the tree when something is, happens to the tree, a pruning cut, or it's broken.
So this is another example of whether or not an appropriate cut was made. And I like this photo too, because the blue arrow on the top is a correct cut. You can see that callus beginning to form in that kind of a horseshoe shape. And then the red arrow, the bottom of that cut was not made correctly. That callus never formed. So that is a portion that will probably never heal correctly. And then understanding where to cut, how many cuts, up to 3/4 inches in diameter, with shears or pruners, or a saw. So understanding, again, what your goals are and what, ultimately why you're pruning, and size of the branch will determine your tools that you need. And then on the right, where the first cut is, that's another example. Using your saw, you undercut that first cut. Your second cut removes the weight. And then your third cut is your appropriate cut. And so bigger branches, bigger tools. On your left, typically a smaller cut is made. It's a single cut with hand pruners or with small clippers. And the good, the bad, and the ugly. Another snapshot of a good pruning cut on the left. The callus is forming. It's covering up that pruning cut. And then the ugly is just that. That's so bad. That will never heal. It will never grow back. It will most likely never really look good again. But again, people prune for a variety of reasons. The bad on the right, the undercut was not done or not done appropriately and allowed that bark to tear, which won't heal either. And another point that we wanted to make in this presentation is tree paint. So it used to be common practice that when pruning happened, it was either painted or covered or bandaged in some way. But studies have shown that that's not the best thing to do for trees. The best thing is to make the appropriate pruning cuts in the appropriate places and then leave them open, and the tree will naturally heal itself.
All right, we're going to talk now about some of the goals for pruning, and probably your number one goal should be pruning for strength. You know, looking at the tree and making sure whatever you do first is all about strength for the future for that tree. Making good decisions early is so critical. And, you know, sometimes we miss those opportunities and sometimes you can still do it later. But as we know, a larger cut, it heals a lot slower. So it's a lot easier to make those decisions when the tree's smaller. So we're going to kind of go into all of these a little bit, but we're going to discuss, you know, what a competing leader is, what a codominant stem is, what included bark is. And again, talking about suckers and water sprouts, how they really don't help the tree. And then just kind of also any rubbing, crossing branches, they're just going to be trouble. So you definitely want to look at removing those. So go into this. I don't know how many of you have seen a tree like this. My mom had a cherry tree that looked just like this. Split, you know, same size diameter branches, kind of a fairly tight connection, and it did the same thing. And the reason is that these are called codominant stems because they're the same, basically the same diameter. They don't have a branch collar, they don't have a branch protection zone. So they can be a real problem. And really, there's only a couple things you can do successfully with these trees. If you see one of these and it hasn't split yet, and it's still pretty small, you can remove it, one of the forks. The other thing, if it's a larger tree and it's a valuable tree, an arborist can actually go and use some braces. You know, if it's a smaller tree, they can even put a bolt through it, will hold it together. But one of the problems with these trees, like it said, that even if it's small, it may take a long time if it heals. So watch out for these. These are really important to find early. And then this is another example of sometimes, well, like this picture at the bottom. See, the diameter of those were a little bit different. It's not as tight a fork, and there's actually this kind of rounded base. Luckily, see this right here, that's part of a little bit of a branch bark ridge. So someone did take successfully one side off. So sometimes you can do that. Again, if it's young, it's not that big, it should heal and you won't have as much of an issue later on. But the other thing to look at in trees is watch out for, here's a stem that was starting to compete. It wasn't maybe a codominant stem, but it's one that it's just going to not be helpful. And so you can take that off. You can either take it off right at the trunk. And sometimes if there's a lateral, you can even take it off on the side, which will just take some of that strength of that branch away so it won't compete with the main leader. Because what you really want to do, especially here with snow, it's really good to have trees that have one nice strong leader. And what they've done up here, it's a little hard to see because it's probably off a little bit, but you can see there were 2 leaders here. And that happens so often. So just if you see one that you don't think is strong, you can just take that off. And if you take that off when they're young, you just are going to really help that tree long term. It's going to be a problem in the future. So it's a good thing to take off those smaller ones. And this was something that I found. I thought it was a great illustration of inside the tree, see what's happening. So if you have a tree that has a very tight branch angle, as they call it, narrow crotch, isn't that great? And what happens is when you have these really narrow angles in the tree itself doesn't have wood underneath that. What happens is the bark gets included and you don't have wood until way down here. So you can imagine if all you have in that section is bark, it is not strong. Bark is not, it doesn't mesh together like wood. And so that's, becomes a super big issue. And then over here, just a little bit more of an open angle, and there's good wood. There's no included bark here, makes for a very strong tree. So when you're pruning, look for these 2. These are really important. And the next slide, I'll show you what happens if you don't catch them. So here's just another inside of the tree with, this is the bark that's included. This is a cross section of a tree. And then on this tree, see how tight this was? There's a lot of trees in Hailey that are like this, just, but what has happened is the bark is in there. And the way you know it is see right here, this little ridge, it turns in. And then there's included bark. Sometimes you'll just have a nice little ridge that comes out, probably fine. But when you see it indented like that, then there's big trouble. And then this is what happens. So this tree split, and here's the included bark inside the tree. And I didn't get to look it up, but Stephanie and I visited about this. We think that probably between codominant stems and included bark, it's probably 85–90% of the failures if you ever have a branch or a tree fail. Most of the time it's one of these. It's not the tree, it's just that something wasn't caught. So really important to catch those when they're young. So we talked about pruning for strength. So another really important thing is just a pruning for form and function. And when I say form, I'm sorry, I don't like Dr. Seuss trees. Some people do. But I mean, looking at a tree and thinking about its natural form. And so one of the things that you can do, and we'll talk about the period of time in the life of the tree when you want to do this, but look at the tree and think about where you want to see the main branches. Some trees have so many branches and then they become a problem later. So looking at a tree and deciding, which of these, branches along the main stem are too crowded. And then that's something with time you can start working through and looking for a nice, called scaffold branches over time and try and work that way. That way, as the tree gets older, there's plenty of room for those branches to grow. And you let a little wind through there, a little more sun, it makes the tree healthier. And of course, then trees that have branches headed for trouble, like this tree down here, it's blocking the stop sign, we've seen branches that impede people on sidewalks, or they're going for your garage, or, you know, they're just going to be a trouble branch. So again, branches don't move up the trees. So consider where they are and where they're going to end up in another 5 years, and, you know, go ahead and remove those before they're large. And sometimes you'll have limbs that will start, instead of growing out like a natural tree would grow, you might have some inward branches. So those are good to remove too. This is just a little illustration, kind of going back through, looking for, like, this branch, they have it dotted, so they were going to remove that because it was too low. Kind of going through the tree, some of these branches were kind of getting up into the other branches. And so that just kind of gives you a generic look at a tree, of what you want to see. And we didn't really talk about it. You can't see it. It says 2 types of cuts. So there's a heading cut and a thinning cut. And I just wanted to talk about the difference. So a heading cut down here is when you cut a branch at a bud, or even sometimes people will just cut a branch just in the middle of the branch. That's actually called a heading cut. But for shade trees and trees in general, except for maybe fruit trees, we use thinning cuts, which means you cut, like this one was cut, it was a lateral that was cut off, it's gone over here. And for some reason, maybe they wanted to be shorter trees, so they cut the terminal off, but right here is a nice lateral that was left, but they didn't cut to just a single bud. That's important. So you'll see a lot of times heading cuts are used a lot for shrubs, makes them bushier, sometimes some fruit trees. So these are a couple examples. You still don't want to, in general, you never just want to just try and make it round. Some people will, but but you don't do that. A heading cut is hard on a tree, a shade tree. So when you see a top tree, basically that was a heading cut. And we know that that doesn't work. So let's just talk about for the life of the tree. So if you've just planted a tree, don't do anything except if there was a broken branch, you can remove that. Don't do anything else, because if you've just planted a tree, whether it's a containerized or a balled and burlap, the roots, there aren't that many roots to what that tree needs. If you cut any leaves, that means less, remember the sugars, and you don't want to remove, any leaves if you don't have to, because you need to start producing enough sugars to help those roots get reestablished. If you plant a balled and burlap tree, when they're spading the tree to put it in balled and burlap, they cut about 90% of the roots off. So all the more reason to keep as much of a crown as you can for a couple years. And then by the 3rd year, you're going to be able to see there might be some suckers developing. This might be when you go and look, well, there's some narrow branches, there's some issues with codominant stems, maybe just starting, then you can go ahead and take care of those. But leave as many of the lower limbs as possible, because those help make a stronger taper, a better trunk. And then, a lot of this, we maybe bought a house or haven't gotten around to maybe pruning a tree. So maybe there's some things that you need to do later. And this is just kind of generically 5 to 7 years later. That's when you need to really make sure you address those lower limbs that are going to be a problem. And you can start thinning the limbs on the trunk or removing some branches so there's plenty of space for the tree to grow. And if you've done a good job up to like these first 7 years after your tree's planted, hopefully, a lot of times with a shade tree, if you've done good structural pruning, then you just need to look for dead, damaged, broken branches. Might have to do some other work, but hopefully that's it. So it's important, those first, up to a decade is really critical. I kind of like this. This is the Arbor Day, one from the Arbor Day bulletins. Family A. Maybe it's good. I mean, if they didn't know what they were doing, maybe it's good they didn't prune their tree, but it kind of just shows what happens for your poor little trees. You got broken branches, you got suckers, just way too many limbs if you don't prune it when it's young. And then, whoops, family B, I love that, Not sure we have all those perfect trees, but I sure like it. And then, so when's the best time of the year to prune? So you can prune most of the time, but I think it's really nice to do it late winter, early spring, before there's leaf break, because you can really see the structure of your tree. You're not removing a limb that's already leafed out. So that's a good thing. Sometimes in the fall works too. Just make sure you wait until, if it's a deciduous tree that the leaves are off. And some trees like maples can be a problem that you wouldn't want to prune it after it's leafed out or close to leafing out, because you'll have a lot of sap coming out. Conifers could be also an issue too, because if they produce a lot of sap, like a pine, they actually can attract some insects that you don't want to attract. And
Linda,
then,
could I ask you just
yeah.
a quick question about the pruning in the fall after leaf drop?
Mhm.
So it seems like if it's right after leaf drop, then wouldn't that sap still be making its way to the roots, or how do you know? Or sometimes we get a cold snap and the leaves, kind of freeze on the tree. But anyway, could you talk just a little bit more about that?
Well, I think you need to really wait until you know there won't be a flush of growth.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it probably needs to be a good freeze already. Stephanie, what do you?
Yeah, I think, Linda, you're right, because the tree needs to truly go dormant before the sugars stop flowing, before that movement is finished. And if that movement is still happening, that's where you'll see that sap run out. So late fall is a good time, or early spring. So even before now, this time of year.
And then we do have a question. It actually has to do with the earlier slide, but I don't think you necessarily need to go back to it. Somebody says they've seen so many trees in Hailey that are 20, 30 years old, and they haven't really been pruned. And where do you start with those besides just removing the dead or the broken branches?
I mean, some of them, it depends on the species. If you can find, smaller limbs that you can remove and still do benefit to the tree, I, you can certainly prune branches over 5 inches, but anything, I would say 4 or 5 inches and larger, those wounds are going to slowly heal. So if you have an older tree, but you can still do some good, there'll be like just, weak, smaller branches scattered through an older tree that you can still remove them and still do some benefit for the tree. But I would say I would always err on the side of smaller branches if you can make improvements, go with the smaller branches.
Interesting. And then we have another question about maple trees not losing their leaves in the fall, but they're still not falling off the tree yet. I guess one question is, why would that happen? And then the second question related to this talk is, can you still, like now, if you need to or feel like you need to prune that maple tree, even though the leaves are still on the tree, is that okay? So why might they still be on the tree? And then regarding pruning.
So in the fall, I mean, it's a complex process. So, you know, it's triggered by temperature, it's triggered by day length. There's a lot of things that go into why a tree starts to go dormant. And it's it's not an overnight process. So I think sometimes there's some trees that might not go dormant as early as others. And the weather cues have kind of messed it up a little bit. And so what makes a leaf drop is there has to be there's a layer of cells that form, abscission layer. And so I think if there's some things that have happened, it's been confused. It was cold, then it warmed up, and then maybe it didn't get colder until later. Then there might have been something that the tree misread as far as when to go dormant. And I would say, I mean, I think they could still be pruned. It shouldn't kill the tree to have some sap run, but I mean, it's just something you don't necessarily want to encourage, but I think they could still be pruned. What do you think, Stephanie?
Yeah, there are some deciduous trees that just tend to hang on to their leaves into the fall or into the winter. And it's species specific. Maples keeping their leaves, I've seen that a lot this winter. Almost to a level of annoyance, because the leaves they just kind of trickle off over the winter and then just create a bigger mess in the spring. But I think, like Linda said, there are a lot of triggers that cause that abscission to happen. And it seems like environmental factors are what is prohibiting that. So I think it's just kind of one of those years where the maples didn't get the memo that they were truly supposed to lose their leaves, I think is what happened.
And I think that even things like if you fertilize like later in the season for a tree, I think that could be an issue too. So like Stephanie said, like trees like oaks, they just tend to hold on to their leaves. But I've seen a lot of variation. Like for the most part, we have an aspen and it pretty much loses its leaves, but our neighbors doesn't. So I don't know if it's when they turn off their water, if it's later. It's really hard to say. But we do see that a lot where there's, if the weather's a little off, then you can see those changes.
Thank you.
You bet. So one other point that I think is really important, especially if you have apple trees, that you make sure you prune those in the winter, because if there's fire blight or other diseases, you're going to be less prone to spread that. So that's another really important piece. And we didn't cover it, like, we had talked about it before, but definitely you have to make sure you're pruning your trees at the right time. Stephanie and I were talking about lilacs and how, the best time is really shortly after they flower, when they
Mhm.
start kind of, looks like they're forming some seeds. So don't do it in the winter because you'll remove some flower buds. All right,
All right.
Stephanie.
Yeah, a few other points um, is understanding what your best tools are. The shears on the left there, those are a wonderful tool. They're really small. They're for small pruning, small branches. They can be sharpened, which is a good thing. That's always really nice to have really sharp, whether it's a saw or shears. The pruning saw on the right, um, the curved blade, triple teeth. It's a pretty gnarly tool. So those are two very, very good tools to have, especially you want sharp tools. And then this is another example of that cut where you make that first cut underneath, and then your second cut, the first cut here is right where they are taking this branch off. So the weight of the branch is off. Yeah, thanks for that. So the weight of the branch is off, but that undercut is actually where that full cut through will be made. So the weight is gone, and then that cut is made so that when the branch is truly cut through, there won't be any tearing of the bark. So that's just another illustration of that particular tool making that cut.
Yeah, they don't show an undercut here, but maybe what they probably did was undercut this and then cut through, which
Yeah.
on not a huge branch,
Or
you can get away with it, but you still need an undercut somewhere.
Clean and sanitize and sharpen your tools. Those are three very, very important things to do. You want good tools to make good cuts. Linda mentioned, was it blight that you mentioned? Apple blight?
Fire blight.
Fire blight. There are all kinds of fungus, lots of things that can spread if you have a diseased tree. You especially want to clean your tools after each cut. And then sharp tools will make for clean cuts. You just want to take care of your tools, because if you know where to make your cut, but you have just poor tools or not sharp tools or dirty tools, then your cut will be compromised even in the correct place. And safety, of course, we have to mention safety.
Could I ask a quick question about sharpening your blade? How do you, I have like a bypass, Felco bypass pruners, like you showed in a previous picture. How do you sharpen those blades?
Go to YouTube.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean, I know there's a certain type of file that you can use. And I have to say that I let Paul do that. But yeah, I mean, I think actually if, I don't know if there's anyone local here that does that, but I think, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think, yeah, I think you can just go on YouTube and look for the best way.
I just bought a new blade when I felt like it was time to sharpen it, because I didn't know how to do that.
Well, and that's the nice thing about, if you're buying those good shears, that they have replacement blades. So that pays. And I mean, I think it's like saws, saws, it pays to pay a little bit more, and then of course take care of them. And when I got my pruning saw, because I for a short time I I had a little business when we lived in Utah, and it was so sharp, I kept cutting myself. But they're wonderful because these new, these pruning blades have these triple teeth, and they are fantastic.
Mhm.
And we didn't even mention loppers, but sometimes loppers are fine. But sometimes I think if you can't do hand clippers, you should go to a saw. That's just me. Loppers can work too, just no hedge trimmers.
Yeah, I agree. Loppers can get a little messy because I don't always have the strength to close the loppers and make that cut because the tool is designed for a bigger branch, but I don't have the strength to do that. So for me personally, in order to get that cut, a saw works better than a pair of loppers. Yeah, I agree.
And I've had issues with loppers where I can cut, but the bark tears because I did do an undercut. It's a little bigger branch, and some bark just
Mhm.
tends to tear. So if I just feel a lot better about either using the shears on a smaller branch,
Mhm.
just then going to a saw and undercutting, and then I know it won't tear. Because once it tears,
Yep.
yeah, it's not a good thing.
So safety, you have to be safe out there. Gloves, leather is a good choice. Eye protection. There's every cut you make, especially with the saw, there will be sawdust, and it will inevitably get into your eye. Hole saws can be a wonderful tool, but again, they can be a little bit more dangerous because it's a saw on the end of a pole. So you want to be really, really careful there, and also using ladders. So this talk is young shade trees, and we want to emphasize that we're talking about young shade trees. As you get into more mature, bigger shade trees, or any tree, don't hesitate to call a professional. Our last point here mentions electric lines. So whether it's high up off the ground or electrical lines or near a structure, if it feels a little bit bigger than what you're comfortable with, don't hesitate to call for help. We hope you learned a lot. And not only are there wonderful professionals in the Valley, feel free to reach out to Linda or myself if you have questions. And you're on your way to successful pruning.
We actually have a couple of questions that have slipped in here at the very end. Someone asks, I mean, we know that deer and elk eat the buds off of our shrubs. Do we need to cut those shrubs back in any particular way when that happens? Do you have any advice or recommendations for that?
I would just say, like, they always browse our dogwood, and so I just usually trim back before they start growing to a bud. And then we didn't talk about it because we didn't get into pruning shrubs. So when you're cutting near a bud, make sure you go above it a little bit, and it's better if it's on the angle. But some shrubs, some trees will have buds on both sides, so you just have to go straight across on those. But I think it's a good idea to go ahead, because when they browsed them, it's a broken branch, and it's been basically pruned in the middle of a branch. They don't go to a bud. So
No, they don't.
haven't taken the class. But I would say, I think it's a good idea. I do that every year with our dogwoods. I go back and see what they've done, and
And then I have a personal question. I know you're not talking about fruit trees, but I have an old neglected fruit tree that I've been working to sort of lower its main branches so I can actually reach them. And then I prune along the top of the branch to encourage the growth to go kind of out and out this way. I get quite a bit of water sprouts coming off the top because that's where they want to go. When you talk about taking a quarter of the tree's
Live.
life off, do you include those water spouts when you're talking about that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess I never realized this before, but yes, you do, because they still are producing. And so I would say, you know, you pick the ones first to take off that are going to be the weakest. You can tell if they have a good connection. Some are a little better than others, and then just start working them off. And then if you don't take as many off, maybe you'll break some of that trend to have a huge flush.
Okay. And then last but not least, someone asks if you need a home to practice on. I think Anne is offering up her home
Wow.
in case you want to snip at her place.
Well, we
that's
could probably
great.
do that. We were going to do some city trees in the right of way that have been kind of neglected, but yeah, we could always do that. Oh, and you know, we didn't talk about conifers. So because mostly we were talking about deciduous shade trees, but as far as conifers, so they often, there's a lot of species you have to look out for that do have forks. And so again, it's the same thing. Sometimes, unfortunately, those forks are up high on the tree and they may be hard to reach, but definitely watch for those. So you definitely want to take those out because it really becomes a hazard and they will split out at some point. And I have a point for, like, if anyone has mugo pines and they just get tired of them just growing and growing. And you can do this with other pines that you don't want to get too big. So what you do is you don't take your clippers, and you watch for when the candles start to lengthen in the spring, and when they're not fully grown, but when they just started to grow a little bit, just snap it off about halfway. And you won't have the growth will be reduced. But if you prune that, it's really easy to have extensive dieback on the branches. But that's one thing you can do if you're trying to control a mischievous pine.
Well, great. We'll end it there with mischievous pines. Stephanie Cook and Linda Ries, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. And good luck, everybody, on your pruning adventures.